Well, welcome everyone. It's really nice to see you all today, and we're here for the purposes of the ASME Research Paper Award. The Research Paper Award we award each year based on submissions which the Educational Research Committee judge. So I'm very pleased to say in the last year we had some really strong submissions, and from those very good submissions we have 3 finalists. We have Eva, Michael and Dawn who are going to present to you today. So I'll just let them say hi first of all. Eva.
Hello everyone. Thank you for having me today.
Michael.
Hi everyone, I'm going to lie and say I'm really looking forward to it, but I'm interested to hear colleagues' presentations, so looking forward to it.
And Dawn?
Yes, hi there, I'm Dawn, and a very similar sentiment from me, slightly quaking in my boots, but looking forward to it as well.
Yeah. So in a non-COVID year, the finalists would have presented at the ASME scientific meeting, which happens in July. But as you know, last year we had a little bit of disruption. I don't know if any of you have noticed the global pandemic. Anyway, because of that little bit of disruption, we weren't able to run the conference. And so we thought it would be really lovely for the presenters to have the opportunity to do this as part of a bite-sized event, because it reaches a wide audience and then it's available for posterity. So the session will be recorded. I hope that's okay with everyone who's here, and it means people can watch it afterwards. So you've met our 3 presenters and you'll hear more from them shortly. I would also like to introduce you to our Educational Research Committee panel, who are here to judge the finalists from the 3 presenters today. So I have Dr. Alison Ledger.
Hi everybody.
Professor Alison Stevens.
Hi, lovely to be here. Looking forward to it.
And Dr. Matt Webb.
Hi, also looking forward to this. Thank you.
I'm also pleased to say thank you very much to our ASME office, to Lee Morris and Jenny Ogg, who've been doing the work in the background, setting things up. And last not least, I think we'd better say hello to Sandra Nicholson, who is the chair of ASME, who's been able to join us today. Okay, so before much more ado, I'll just say each of the presenters is going to have 50 minutes to present their slides and explain what their paper is on. We'll have 5 minutes question and answer, and we'll manage that through the chat function. So after each presentation's finished, I'll invite the audience, including our panel, to ask questions, and I'll read the questions out, and we'll have 5 minutes for each of those. So I'm really looking forward to hearing our presenters today. So, and Eva is going to present first. Okay, so whenever you're ready, Eva.
So, good afternoon again, and thank you for the opportunity of presenting our research today. My name is Eva Henner, and I work at the Institute of Medical Education at the University of Bern in Switzerland. The research today presented is part of my PhD project, which investigates multi-source feedback in residency training. And the study I present today is a qualitative study on the influencing factors and the impact. So why do we investigate multi-source feedback? Everybody knows that feedback is important for learning and should support learning. But the use of multi-source feedback needs a lot of resources and time from many persons involved. So if it is done, it should be conducted as effectively as possible. But still, there is a broad gap in the literature. Still, little is known about the impact of the context and the learning climate. Little is known about the mentoring relationship and the role of the facilitator. And even the actual effects on clinical performance are quite unclear. So with a better understanding of the factors which influence the impact of multi-source feedback, we hope to support its use. Our research questions were first, which factors influence the impact of multi-source feedback as perceived by participants of multi-source feedback? And second, what are the impacts of multi-source feedback as perceived by participants of multi-source feedback? Before I explain our methods to you, I would like to introduce you to our setting and to clarify some terms we use. So for our study, multi-source feedback was implemented at the Department of Surgery at the Pediatric University Hospital Zurich. And it was used with a formative aim to individually guide learners in their training. The participants were residents from pediatric surgery and pediatrics, and they received feedback from raters from different fields of work. They had up to 15 raters from their peers. They had nurses from the ward and the theater. They had consultants and anesthesiologists. And those raters gave the feedback via multi-source feedback questionnaires in written form and anonymously. And the feedback was collected by a supervisor. Together in a feedback conversation, the resident and the supervisor contrasted the feedback to self-assessments. And the aim of this conversation was to formulate learning goals for the next period of training. The questionnaire we used was based on the CANMATS rules, and all items could be rated with a scale and also with narrative comments. We conducted a constructivist qualitative study, and data was collected in form of focus group interviews with the participants of multi-source feedback, which means with raters, residents, and supervisors. And we aimed to collect their experiences and views. And why did we choose to do focus group interviews? Our aim was that we wanted participants to discuss their views and to exchange their opinion on the use of multi-source feedback. And therefore we decided to separate the groups. So we separated the residents from the raters from the supervisors with the aim that residents should exchange their opinions as freely as possible. Within their groups, they represented all kinds of participants of multi-source feedback. So for the raters, we had all different fields of work represented and different years of work experience. And also for the residents, we had residents from both specializations, from pediatrics and pediatric surgery, and also from different years of training. We analyzed data in form of a reflexive thematic analysis as described by Brown and Clark. So in terms of the results, the first part of the results are the influencing factors, and we found 8 themes on that. So they can broadly be understood as concerning the generation of feedback or the feedback conversation. Some of our results confirm earlier literature, some are new or deepen the knowledge. Concerning the generation of feedback, we heard that a clear goal is needed, so participants need to be informed if multi-source feedback is used with a formative or summative goal. The raters need to be trained on their task. These findings are not new, not surprising. We also found that the timing during a rotation might be an obstacle because residents rotate quite often, and they expressed that when the multi-source feedback is done too late during a rotation, they can't work with the feedback not that much anymore. And when it's too early during a rotation, the raters have problems in observing them. We also heard from the raters' point of view that they would support a better continuity of observation. They offered to guide the residents even more longitudinally. And they suggested that they should not only do one multi-source feedback for a resident, but they would like to be the rater for the next multi-source feedback as well. And they even offered to be informed about the learning goals for that they could keep an eye on that. In terms of the feedback conversation, we heard that narrative comments helped to formulate learning goals. We heard that the comparison of the self-assessment to the ratings was perceived very helpful. And we had given them a structure for the conversation, which was just a simple documentation sheet and not mandatory, but supervisors as well as residents perceived that helpful to have a structure they could stick to. And also was discussed the role of the supervisor, whether this should be a person from the same department or whether it might be an external person to avoid role conflicts. So they discussed whether it could be a supervisor from another specialty, another hospital, or perhaps even somebody from the human resources department. But the participants came to the conclusion that a supervisor from the same work environment is needed to make sure the supervisor can interpret the feedback correctly with all the details, and also to be able to formulate realistic learning goals together with the resident. So these are the influencing factors. And in terms of impact, they reported a professional development of residents. And more unexpectedly, they also reported an enhanced teamwork. So the raters explained that this was due to their raised understanding of the residents' work. They said that because they gained a better understanding what residents' tasks are, it was more easily to collaborate, and they also communicated more. Also, the raters expressed their raised commitment on training. So they expressed that they would like to take a more active role in training, and they also said that they felt it as part of their work to support the training of residents. So these are the results which more or less directly address our research questions, what the influencing factors and the impacts are. So next, I would like to present you the more unexpected results. And these concern a connection we found between our study or our study results and identity formation theory. So I will briefly explain identity formation theory to you as described by Sillinger et al. And I try to connect it to our setting of multi-source feedback. So in identity formation theory, as described by Sillinger et al., they explain a connection between one's personal professional development and one's socialization into a community of practice. And this perspective might help to understand many of our influencing factors we found and some of the results. So what they say is that the aim of training is not only a gain of competencies, but also the formation of a professional identity, in addition to the gain of competencies. And they say that it is needed for the formation of the identity to repeatedly reflect and reinterpret one's role. And the resident not only develops as a single person, but also becomes a member of the community of practice. And the raters play an important role here. So following identity formation theory, they can be defined as socializing agents, which means that they help with the integration into the community of practice. And what they do is to define the role for the resident. And transferring that to multi-source feedback, the narrative comments can be seen as an expression of their expectations to the role and help the resident to shape the role. And the supervisor is not only a clinical supervisor, but also an educational supervisor. And the supervisor helps to assemble the competences into an identity. And the supervisor can also help with the reflection on the role. So these results might, or the finding that identity formation theory fits with the results of our study might help to explain how multi-source feedback works and might help to explain some of the influencing factors and the results. So in summary, what are our conclusions? Our results have relevance for practice. So in addition to the best practice already known, we found more details on influencing factors resulting in practical recommendations. To name only the newer recommendations, we would advise to allow the continuity of observation if that's possible. We would also recommend to adapt the timing of multi-source feedback to the rotations of residents. We suggest to choose the supervisor fitting to the content of the multi-source feedback, and also to provide a structure for the feedback conversation. We found an unexpected impact of multi-source feedback besides the training of competencies in terms of the enhanced teamwork and the raised commitment of raters. And so we think that multi-source feedback might be used with a broader potential, focusing not only on a resident's competencies, but also on the community of practice and the professional identity development. So what's the relevance for further research? We think that the novel perspective of identity formation theory might help to investigate multi-source feedback further. I would like to thank the participants of this study at the University Hospital Zurich and also my co-authors, especially Sören Hovendiek, who is the supervisor of my PhD project. And I would like to thank you for your attention today, and especially the ASME Education Research Committee for the opportunity of presenting research and for bringing researchers together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Eva. That was a very interesting start, and I'm sure everyone in the audience will appreciate as well the importance of this topic of feedback in all areas of medical education and training, and how challenging it can be, but how important for development. So I'd just like to invite people to ask questions. I've got a comment from Michael that says, I love the conceptualization of the various multi-source feedback roles and how they relate to communities of practice and identity formation. I wanted to ask you, Eva, when you mentioned your raters, who are the people involved in providing the multi-source feedback? What roles do they have?
Mm-hmm. So our aim was to integrate as co-workers from all fields of work the resident is in contact with. And in our case of residents in pediatrics and pediatric surgery, these were the peers from the same field, the consultants from surgery, also nurses from the ward and from theater. And because of surgery, we included anesthesiologists.
Thank you. And related to that, there was a question from Helen. I wonder whether the residents had any choice in the raters?
Could you repeat that?
Were residents able to choose who they wished to give feedback?
Yes, they were. So we followed the literature, and the literature suggested to do it that way because feedback might be more acceptable if it comes from a writer you have chosen yourself. but they had to stick to a certain mixture. So they had to provide some peers, some nurses, and some consultants. So the mixture was given, and it was also the pool of trained persons, but they could choose from that pool.
Yeah, that's very helpful, thank you. And Alison Stevenson has said, the notion of mentoring or mentor was mentioned. How were the roles of the mentor, the supervisor, and the rater defined and differentiated?
Mm-hmm. So in our case, we had 3 supervisors for the multi-source feedback, and these were 3 consultants at the surgical hospital. And perhaps it's important for you to know that other than in the UK, in Germany and Switzerland, we don't have the concept of clinical supervisors and educational supervisors. So normally your educational supervisor is the same person as your clinical supervisor is. So for multi-source feedback, they had these 3 supervisors who were trained for that job and were paired with one of those 3, and that team went on for the duration of the training. So the other question was on raters.
Yeah, it was just, yeah, it was the role of the rater as compared to the mentor or the supervisor.
Okay, so the raters were just co-workers. And to make sure they had an idea what's important about giving feedback, especially in written form, they were trained for giving feedback and trained for giving feedback in written form.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I've got a comment and a question from Adarsh, who says, a lovely presentation. The multi-source feedback described in your studies being used in the surgical setting in the UK. As your questionnaire was mapped to the CanMEDS framework, does your identity formation finding constitute the hidden curriculum in your setting?
So I'm not sure if I understand the question. So I can see it in the chat. Does your identity formation finding constitute the hidden curriculum in your setting? Constitute the hidden curriculum? I don't know. So it was mapped to the CanMEDS framework, as this is the framework for residency training in Switzerland. And obviously CanMEDS focuses on competencies. And identity formation theory is not in contrast with that, but is an addition, or should be seen as an addition. So forming your professional identity doesn't mean you don't gain competencies, but you do both things in parallel. So I'm not sure what's meant with the hidden curriculum in our setting. So as far as I could find out, the residents and supervisors at Zurich, of course, have a hidden curriculum, but they didn't expose that to us, whether they have identity formation in mind. But from what the narrative comments were, they wrote in the MSF questionnaires, we could tell, of course, there is a hidden curriculum by the narrative comments. Yes.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. I've just got one last question for you now, Eva, from Alison Ledger, who says, thanks, Eva. How can the potential multi-source feedback impact that you identified in the study be best communicated to all of the people involved? So I think Alison's asking, how do you disseminate that and communicate it to people in the clinical settings?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's really an important question, because these are just findings which appeared during the analysis of our data. So our study was not set up with analyzing identity formation theory in mind. So they just turned up and appeared in the analysis. So we haven't confronted our study hospital with that findings, or we of course, the organizations of multi-source feedback know, but we haven't changed the training so far. And I think the place where multi-source feedback is implemented has to decide whether they want to address those additional goals. And I think more research is needed on that topic, because it's only our study which proposes that connection, and we haven't conducted another study so far, and as far as I know, there are no others with that connection. So I think at the moment we can't really draw conclusions from that. It's merely a suggestion where further research could go.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much for that. So I think on behalf of the panel and the audience, we'd really like to thank you, Eva, for your presentation. So you can sit back and relax now. And we'll
Thank you.
give you have Michael now, if you're ready, Michael, to start.
Hi everyone, welcome. So my name is Michael Page. I'm a senior lecturer in education at Barts and the London School of Medicine and Dentistry at QMUL, and the title of my abstract that I'm presenting today is "What does it take to get good feedback?" Which is the million-dollar question, I think, in most educational settings. My abstract title had a subheading as well, which was "What are the conditions needed for high-quality feedback in workplace-based assessment?" And I suppose that can be clarified slightly further by saying that what I was interested in was, what are the features of clinical radiology trainees or their assessment outcomes that were associated in some way with them receiving high quality written feedback in their workplace-based assessments? So that's where we're going, and that's the question we're trying to answer. So this audience probably doesn't need much introduction to workplace-based assessment, but in the UK, it's been required in postgraduate training programs since 2010 by the GMC. These are generalities or generalizations, but they're typically based on observations of clinical practice, although not all. Trainees' performance is judged and rated on a scale a lot of the time, but again, not all of the time. And there's usually an expectation for written feedback to be provided, which is the focus of my study. They have a strange duality in terms of their purpose. What I sometimes call a decision development duality, in that workplace-based assessments are typically aggregated to inform annual decisions about progression from one year of training to the next, and those are therefore quite high stakes decisions and comprise a summative element to workplace-based assessment. However, individual workplace-based assessments are sold as being formative, in that they're supposed to be low stakes, they're orientated towards providing feedback, and therefore are about development. And to orientate people, again, maybe this framework is familiar, but this is an example of what one type of workplace-based assessment, the one that I was looking at, in fact, looks like. So this is normally housed within an e-portfolio, but if you were to print out the assessment framework, this is what it looks like. So this is the radiology direct observation of procedural skills. It's a workplace-based assessment that I chose because it, although it's situated within clinical radiology training, a lot of medical specialties in the UK have a very similar type of assessment. It also involves dealing with a patient as well as equipment and clinical skills, as opposed to the other main radiology assessment, which is all about looking at images and so on, and has less broad applicability for other specialties. And so colleagues will recognize the criteria listed down the left-hand side and numbered down the left-hand side to do with communication and technical skill and infection control and so on. And across the top, there's a nominal rating scale where trainees can be rated according to their performance against those different criteria. So on the very left-hand side, well below expectation for stage of training, if somebody's not doing that well, towards the right-hand side, well above expectation for stage of training. And I mention this because this is, it's possible to work out an average score or an average assessment judgment for each trainee in each DOPS by taking the modal value of these ratings, and I'll return to that idea later in the presentation. One of the other key features of these assessments is a global overall competency rating at the foot of the assessment. Again, I'm drawing these to your attention because they become relevant or particularly relevant later on. So for example, somebody who's at the lowest end of that overall rating scale might be adjudged to need additional support and supervision. Whereas at the other end of the scale, someone might be adjudged to be practicing with very little supervision required and virtually independently, if not independently. So that's the overall judgment dimension. And then the two mandatory fields that exist. So it's possible to leave some of those other fields out if they weren't observed or somebody is not able to comment, but the mandatory fields in this assessment are actually the written feedback fields. And so there's an expectation that assessors provide written qualitative feedback and that trainees also then respond to that within the context of the assessment. So what do we know about workplace-based assessment, about formative assessment generally, and about feedback? Well, from the broader education literature beyond medical education, it's well established that feedback associated with formative assessment can support learners' progress and development. We know that written feedback can be effective and can confer some advantages over verbal feedback. We also know that workplace-based assessment can fulfill a formative function. So I was working at the RCP in 2009, 2010, and the education team there did a lot of the early pilot work. They were small-scale studies, they were pilots, so it was about efficacy, I guess. What was less clear was the effectiveness. So once these assessments have been in place and used for real, how are they functioning? And early indications were that they weren't maybe always functioning as intended, and that's perhaps a slight understatement. But at this point in time, no large national scale studies had been done to either confirm or refute that notion, and that's where my study came in. And so that's just a reminder of the research question, because I've been waffling about all sorts of stuff in between times. So what I was looking at was the features of either the trainees themselves or their assessment outcomes in these workplace-based assessments that might be associated with high quality feedback being given to them. So the methodology, this was a big study. It was originally my PhD. The paper that was drawn from that is itself 6,000 words. And so I'll bounce through some of the methods because they don't all necessarily link fully to some of the conclusions, but all of them are relevant in some way to the conclusions that I'm drawing later on. So that's why I mentioned them. So data extraction, there was a huge quantity of data. So we drew data from the UK National Clinical Radiology Training e-portfolio. And we chose 3 successive years. Those were the first 3 years of this approach to assessment in the UK in radiology. So from 2010 to 2013. And then there was a follow-up year of study in 2016-17 to confirm whether some of the patterns and trends that we'd identified initially had been maintained over time, or whether maybe the system had matured or atrophied or something in the interim, and our findings were maintained. It's a spoiler on that one. So we did descriptive statistical analysis of some trends on all of those assessments, which totaled more than 32,000. And we were looking there at things like, when do the trainees do the assessments? Do they leave them all to the very end of their attachment? Do they spread them through the attachment? How many assessments do they do? Do they do one of these a year? Do they do 21 a year? And what are their outcomes like? Is everyone scoring at the top of the scale, in the middle? Is there a bit of a norm distribution or whatever? So something about the characteristics of the system, really. And some of those features lend themselves towards formative activity. Some of them don't. So for example, doing everything at the end of your attachment, regardless of the quality of the feedback, isn't likely to be particularly formative. But our main interest was in the qualitative nature of the written feedback that was being provided. And so that was analyzed using a coding framework. The coding framework was developed deductively from what we know from the literature about high quality feedback, and also inductively, having done a couple of sweeps of at least 500 feedback fields within the DOPS assessment. And we had come up with a coding framework that covered features of assessment that, again, this group will recognize and be familiar with. So valency was were the assessment comments positive or negative, or a bit of both? Were they specific as opposed to vague? Were they linked to the assessment criteria or linked to some other agenda? We mentioned the hidden curriculum in the previous assignment, the previous presentation. Were they developmental in nature? So were they aimed at encouraging improvement and offering suggestions for that type of activity as well? And having developed that coding framework, we then applied that to a sample of assessments from those 4 years, which totaled 2,500 assessments in total. So it was time-consuming work. And then the final step was, having analyzed that feedback, to look at what conditions, if any, were associated with trainees being given high-quality feedback. So I guess 2 questions arise from that. How did we define high quality feedback? So that was defined qualitatively, derived from the literature. We set quite a high bar initially. So we wanted to see positive and negative comments, so balanced feedback. We thought those comments should be specific in both cases. We thought they should be linked to the assessment criteria and offer suggestions for future development. We also, drawing on some of Kluger and Denise's work on feedback, we initially thought there should be the absence of comments that would direct a trainee's attention to themselves. So comments about somebody being a good egg or something, or being a nice person, Kluger and Denise suggested, were actually so distracting that they tended to overwrite any potential benefit of other feedback about outcomes or processes or whatever. So that was how we set out to define high quality feedback. And then the thing that is possibly going to cause a little bit of brain meltdown was how we tried to look for conditions within the population that would bring about or be associated with high quality feedback. And so we used an approach called qualitative comparative analysis. And in short, it's an approach to analyzing large naturalistic data sets. So data sets that you find in the field in social sciences, not in kind of laboratory controlled conditions. So it's good at working with kind of fuzzy, messy data, as we tend to turn up when we do these kind of large population studies. And so simply how it works is that it's a mathematical approach to looking at a given outcome, and our outcome was this notion of high quality feedback, and then running a mathematical test on a number of possible associated conditions. So for example, you might hypothesize that someone who needs additional supervision should also then be receiving high quality feedback, and we look to see if that association was present. If you're a visual person, this might help you. So this answers the question of how do you decide if that link is there or not? And the way you decide is mathematically quite simple, but conceptually a little bit tricky. So mathematically, it's just about working out the overlap between your outcome and the condition that you're hypothesizing might be linked to the outcome. And that overlap is often displayed as a Venn diagram. So in this Venn diagram, I'm only going to show one of these, by the way. In this Venn diagram, we've got an imaginary condition that we've called C. That might be somebody being told they need additional supervision. That's our condition. And then we've got our outcome, which is high quality feedback. And as you can see here, the important feature is that the high quality feedback circle is completely within the condition circle. What that means is the only way you get high quality feedback is if you have that condition present. So we would say that that condition is necessary in order to have high quality feedback. The other thing to notice is all of the white space here around C, which means that it's possible to have the condition but not have the outcome. In other words, the condition is not sufficient to bring about the outcome. So it's not sufficient in order to generate high quality feedback. If I've lost you, it's explained in more detail in the paper. The findings that we derive from that are a bit more interesting and accessible. So the first key finding was that according to our definition of high quality feedback, there wasn't any present in any of the 2,500 assessments that we analyzed. So we had to revise our definition and make it much less stringent. So we dropped our requirement for the absence of personal comments, for example. We dropped our requirement for specificity. So even vaguely positive and negative comments were suddenly part of our concept of high quality feedback, along with linkage to assessment criteria and so on. And still, it was present in very small numbers, only about 5% of the assessments that we analysed from each of those 4 years. But having found some high quality feedback, where and when did we find it? So what were the conditions that seemed to be associated with that? Well, we found that to get high quality feedback, a trainee needed to be in the core stage of training, in other words, in the earliest phase of their postgraduate radiology training. They needed to have had quite a low score on their assessment, and they needed to have that recommendation for additional supervision. So they were scored at the very bottom end of that global criterion. If those things were true, then somebody may have received high quality feedback. However, a bit of a killer finding was that none of those conditions by itself was sufficient to guarantee high quality feedback. And by that, what we meant was, even if you have a low average assessment score, even if you need additional supervision, you're still very unlikely to get high quality feedback in your workplace-based assessment form. As I say, which is quite a damning finding. So to answer the so what was quite a big so what. Written feedback is only provided to the most junior trainees and those with the lowest assessment outcomes. And even then, it's only provided rarely. And so the conclusion from that, it seems pretty stark, but essentially what we concluded is if you want formative assessment in medical education, it doesn't seem that this is the way to do it. In terms of the now what, so our recommendations based on all of that, well, we had recommended that rethinking this dual purpose of development and decision, formative and summative and workplace-based assessment, and decoupling formative assessment from high-stakes decisions would be important. If we're going to do formative assessment, we should probably adopt a more comprehensive concept of formative practice, such as you find in school-based and higher education. So that involves things like co-construction of learning activities, dialogic feedback in communities of practice, which we've already been talking about today, developing trainees in terms of their self-assessment, peer self-assessment and self-regulation capabilities. And all of that requires a lot of appropriate and high level, I would argue, professional development for medical educators. The final thing to consider, and I'll end on this point, is what we're wondering actually is if we need to conceptualize professional learning in medical education more satisfactorily. So not unlike Janet Grant's critique of competency-based curricula in surgery, I would ask the same question here. Have we really thought about what professional learning looks like and should look like before we start to create these ways of improving the process? Or have we just adopted something from another educational setting, created a checklist and some boxes to fill in and rolled that out instead? Thank you. There was a lot of stuff in there. I realize. I apologize if it was too quick or if there was too much. But thank you to the Royal College of Radiologists for supporting the study, and really happy to take any questions, including what on earth is qualitative comparative analysis.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Really interesting. It fits very nicely with the previous presentation, but perhaps more shocking in nature. As Sandra has already commented, it is quite shocking, really, that time and energy is being spent on giving feedback, which is not very high quality at all. Anyway, we already have a question from Alison Ledger. Hi, Michael, I'm less familiar with postgraduate medical training. Why radiology training? So why did you choose radiology? Was this a training pathway you or your supervisors are familiar with? Was it a problem identified in radiology reporting that you were responding to? And to what degree would these findings be applied to other specialties?
5 questions in one. I'll do my best. So the connection with radiology, I guess this demonstrates the usefulness of networks when you're trying to get your research done. So I was actually working at the RCP at the time, and we were working with the Royal College of Radiologists on a consultancy basis. So I was rolling out a lot of the training around workplace-based assessment and supervision because they were slightly later to the party and had asked to work with the Royal College of Physicians on that. However, what I noticed was that what I was told was there wasn't much interest in this type of research being done at the RCP. And so my contact at the RCR at that time, the director of education there, was interested in taking this research forward. We had already, through our pilot studies at the RCP, developed a bit of a hunch that some of these findings might be out there, but nobody had done the research at that point. So it was simply a combination of us following our research instincts and working with someone who was interested in really shining a light and digging deep into the data that were there, and being supportive of and open to that process, really. So it wasn't that they saw a particular problem. I think the sense was, so that colleague had also been a colleague at the RCP and then moved to the RCR. So likewise, they had developed that sense at the RCP and were able to develop the research around that in their new role at the RCR. And being a budding PhD student, I was more than happy to help out.
So I think Alison was also asking about the applicability of your findings to other areas.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, if the research hasn't been done in the other areas, we're guessing, but I don't think it's a wild guess. As I say, the findings, while shocking to this group, were certainly aligned with our suspicions, if not any evidence, because we hadn't unearthed the evidence at the RCP, and the RCP encompasses, at one point, it was well in excess of 20 different specialties. And my reason for choosing the RAD docs was, although the training context is likely to be different, specialty to specialty and hospital to hospital and so on, that type of assessment is one that's commonly found. So you find the docs, I mean, it's being branded a radiology docs, but it's a docs that is slightly tweaked to be fit for purpose. But a docs assessment is found in foundation training. It's found in all of the medical specialties, and is also found in radiology. So it's also one of their go-to assessments. So it's one of their kind of workhorse assessments. It's the one that they require most of from their trainees. Their other one is called a mini imaging interpretation exercise, so very niche and very focused on radiology and looking at images. And so I actively decided not to look at that one because of the less obvious kind of copy across to other specialties and disciplines.
So Matt Webb says, thank you very much for a great presentation. And Matt agrees that the findings are quite shocking. And Matt says, I wondered if there was any data around about who was more likely to give higher quality feedback. Was it more senior or less senior colleagues?
That was one of the conditions we looked at. So we looked at a whole list of different things. And so what I presented are the ones where we find associations. But it was difficult to look at the potential assessor effects. And I suspect there probably was a certain assessor effect as well. So if you've been and done some training in workplace-based assessment, or if you've got your PG cert, maybe you're more inclined to give feedback. But the numbers of assessments in which there was so-called high-quality feedback were so low that once you then divide that up amongst a range of different assessors, then the numbers just weren't analyzable, I'm afraid. I suspect there was. So what I did as a bit of a back of an envelope analysis was just look to see if there were any assessors who gave lots of feedback, and there were one or two in every year who wrote paragraphs and paragraphs. But that's just eyeballing the data. That wasn't proper analysis. But I suspect it's highly assessor dependent, as well as some of the things that we had found associations with.
Really, that's really helpful, Michael. I think we have just about run out of time for questions. There are quite a few more questions, so I'm just wondering if you could respond to those on the chat when you get the chance, and I'll introduce Dawn now. But thank you very much, Michael. That was a really lively presentation, thanks. So if I could just introduce Dawn now, if you're ready, Dawn, to come and present.
So yeah, my name's Dawn Jackson. I'm a GP. And I also work at the University of Birmingham as a senior clinical tutor there. And I'm presenting a project today called Expectations and Experiences, which explores the contribution of supervision to the professional development of GP trainees. And I'm really talking about longer term supervision here, so sort of having a named supervisor for at least 6 months or more. And I'll outline the rationale for our approach to the research today and then tell you a bit more about the results from the study. So I suspect that everybody listening today has some experience of supervision. As we train as health professionals, we've usually been supervised, and some of you listening are probably supervisors yourselves. And I'd hasten to guess that we all have had in our mind the type of supervisor we'd wish for or wish to be, and similarly the sort of trainee we'd wish for or we'd like to be. And a number of these expectations are likely to come from the wider profession. I've put some words up here from an earlier part of this study where we examined all the documents relating to supervision and postgraduate training. And these are some of the messages from the profession about what good trainees and good supervisors should be aiming for. So things like trainees being adult learners, reflective, having insight into their problems, and active participants at the practice are some examples. Now, I don't know about you, but certainly my experience as a trainee suggested that for a number of my colleagues and their supervisors, there was a disconnect between what they were expecting from supervision and the reality of what happened. And from the trainee perspective, you might have heard these referred to as personality clashes, or the absent supervisor, or the micromanager, which at best were irritations, but at worst led to painful instances of relationship breakdown. And so it was these areas of disconnect and clashes that I wanted to try and explore. So really my research came down to looking at two areas. The first related to the trainees themselves and how they were expected to develop professionally within postgraduate training, from novice trainees to the butterflies in the picture of autonomous, independent, qualified GPs at the end of their training. And the second area related to how supervision contributes to this development, particularly focusing on the expectations and the reality of the experiences. And in considering this development of caterpillar to butterfly, we're really thinking about professional identity development. And so figures worlds theory is the theory that I approach this work with because it offers a way to explore identity development. It recognizes the way that the culture around us can shape how we develop. And the culture of GP training is made up of lots of voices and perspectives that tell trainees what being a good trainee is. And also with any culture, we can be thought to have positions in it. There are those who just seem to be in the inner circle and those on the periphery, those at the top and those at the bottom, old-timers or newcomers. And some of that relates to our titles and our roles, but there's often more to it than that. Figured world also recognizes that we have a degree of agency or control in the process of identity development. We can choose the voices that we listen to, and we can push back against the positions we've been cast in. And part of the way that we do that is by the stories that we tell about our experiences and ourselves. And so with that in mind, I wanted to listen to the stories of the GP trainees. So participants were sampled from one of the largest training regions in the UK that has around 300 trainees in their final year of training. And they were sampled based on a range of performance outcomes at end of year assessment, their gender, their training location in the area, and their training status, so whether they were full-time or less than full-time. And this table here just shows the 13 trainees that took part. And you can see that a number of them had an interview at the beginning of their final year of training and then a follow-up interview at the end of the year. And I asked them to tell me their stories of supervision since qualifying as a doctor. And each of the interviews was recorded and transcribed verbatim, along with taking field notes immediately afterwards to capture my response as the researcher. I adapted Brown and Gilligan's listening guide to analyse the interviews. And the listening guide recognises that we are exposed to many voices and perspectives around us, and that these are reflected in the stories that we tell. So it would suggest that the researchers should read each narrative 4 times, but each time they pay attention to a different perspective in the story. So the first reading thinks about the main plot lines and the particular character the narrator is playing. The second reading looks even more closely at the identity claims of the narrator by pulling out any statements where they use the word I and arranging them into verses of a poem. The third reading focuses on relationships, and the fourth focuses on messages from the wider context. And related to figured worlds, I used readings 3 and 4 to also think about the trainee's agency, various artifacts of GP training, and the concept of positions within the figured world. I framed the results today as a discussion, and I focused specifically on the areas of disconnect or dissonance between expectations and the reality experienced by the trainee. And this was evident in expectations around adult learners, legitimate participants, reflective learners, and insight into difficulties. So I'll take each one in turn. The first of these was the expectation that trainees would be adult learners. And Jazz, one of the trainee, refers to this. She says, I get that we're adult learners and we need to do the whole self-directed learning thing. And I suspect many of us are familiar with adult learning and that concept where personalised and tailored approaches to learning are advocated. But the trainees often referred to a feeling that they lacked control when it came to their work and their learning. And Alison sums it up in this slide when she refers to the way her practice would move her down to shorter appointments without warning, leaving her feeling that she'd no control or opportunity to respond. The trainees often alluded to a feeling that although they were adults, they shouldn't complain. They didn't want to be seen as complainers or moaners. And trainees who did complain about what they felt was poor quality supervision talked about feeling guilty for doing so, or suggested that they might be then labelled as a troublemaker. The trainees did recognise they were adult learners, but they didn't just see themselves as adult learners. They referred to changing hats of their own as spouses and partners and parents and carers and academics. And Jazz refers to one of those conflicts where she felt guilty for neglecting her husband who was unwell while she tried to juggle her training commitments. Trainees as legitimate participants within a community of practice is a theory used widely in the postgraduate literature. And in this context, they're presumed to come in as a newcomer, often at the periphery, but as they grow in confidence and experience, they begin to participate more legitimately in the life of the practice. And some of the trainees referred to this in their training. They talked about wanting to be more autonomous with increasing responsibility and more participation. And conversely, their aim was to rely on the support of their supervisor less and less. However, the lived experiences of the trainees didn't always resonate with this, particularly in two regards. The first was they seemed to have different views of what participation was, and there were also threats to participation faced. So I'll take each one in turn. This is Nadia's I poem. It was taken just a couple of weeks before qualification. And actually what Nadia is saying here is, I'm about to qualify, but I still need that support, and I would look to someone for support when I qualify. So she wasn't ready to be on her own. Some of the trainees also talked about being denied opportunities to participate. Practices were thought to be worried about breaching the terms of the junior doctor's contract. And due to practices becoming bigger and more spread out geographically, there were also instances when they missed chances to interact with colleagues and supervisors informally. They were missing those coffee room chats that so often help us to belong and grow in confidence and participate more. Another area of expectation is that good GPs will be reflective learners, and the electronic portfolio is a place to record that reflection. But in this slide, Alison highlights how e-portfolios were often viewed in reality. They were seen as places to collate evidence in the event the trainee might be challenged on their performance, or as places to battle. Here we can see that the educator has put a note on Alison's portfolio that she thinks is unfair, and so she puts a comment of her own back on the portfolio to change that point of view. It's often stated that we want trainees to have insight into their difficulties so that they can target the right areas for improvement. But to get insight, we need to know what's expected of us, what the rules of the game are. And a striking theme within the narrative was that supervisors in the training practice had a prominent role in how the trainees were positioned, and that some were positioned as outsiders. In Seema's story, she described numerous instances where she struggled to get access to the inner world of her supervisor, often standing outside his door, waiting for him to open it and to let her in to ask her questions. And the door provides a vivid picture or artifact of a physical barrier that emphasized her sense of being an outsider. The literature on positioning says we can only look at the world from the position we're afforded. From the position on the outside of things, there was a sense that it was harder for Seema to get to know what was expected of her, and therefore harder to demonstrate that insight. Now, this research was ultimately about how supervision contributes to trainee development. And at the start of the project, I was drawn to Borden's model of the Supervisory Working Alliance, which suggests that quality supervisory relationships encompass negotiation and agreement on the goals and tasks of supervision in the context of an emotional bond. However, I think the results suggest that postgraduate supervision is more complex than that. And what we've done is developed a model to help appreciate this complexity in supervisory discussions. I think for supervision to really work, we need to acknowledge these areas of disconnect, where it's quite possible that trainees and their supervisors may have different expectations. How often do we talk in our supervisory meetings about what each party expects and about what we really mean when we say adult learner or participation or reflection? More clarity is needed. I think we need to recognise that power and positioning is part of what happens in supervision. And when we say a trainee isn't engaged or is lacking insight, is it also to do with the way they've been positioned by their supervisors or within the practice team? And I think that bonds should consider safety, because to do this well, we're likely to be talking about creating a safe space to share our expectations and a place where trainees are brought from the outside to the inside. Ultimately, if we want quality supervision, we need to think about the wider context around it, both in the training practice and within the messages from the wider profession, some of which seem to permeate implicitly, even if not explicitly, such as messages to not complain or not cause trouble. Supervision is complex, and approaching these relationships without that acknowledgement risks a superficial approach to relationships that could become tick box and perfunctory. I think there's real scope in these relationships to engage with this complexity and push for greater clarity in our conversations, to appreciate each other's expectations and subsequently negotiate and collaborate in more meaningful ways. I've put some references up here that have just helped inform the study as a whole. And I really want to thank you for listening today, and particularly thank my PhD supervisors for their support, Ian Davis and Josephine Brady and Donna Dawkins. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for that, Dawn. Very nicely timed presentation. I really liked that debate around the adult learner concept, which so often we think of in positive ways, but you're almost saying it was almost a stick to beat people. The way I understand it, yeah. So I'll just invite the audience and the panel to ask Dawn questions or make comments. Sandra said it was a lovely, sensitive inquiry, and I really liked your approach to analysis. I'm not familiar with that, but it sounds very interesting indeed. How widely do you think it's used within medical education, that analytical approach you used? Brown and Gilligan, is it?
Yeah, so I came across it, it has been used in the nursing literature, but I came across it more in conversations with sort of marginalised groups, so used in rehab and things like that. But what I really like about it is the ability to draw out each of the perspectives in a very systematic way. So I think the systematic side of me really enjoyed that sense of the approach. What doesn't really come through is it listens to the musicality of the narrative as well. It thinks about how the voice changes. And that was really interesting because you often got new insights from that, and it forces the researcher to think about how they're contributing to the story too, which was a lovely way to do that within the analysis.
Yeah, oh, lovely. Thank you. Alison Stephen says, really enjoyable presentation. And regarding positionality, do you think the linear assumptions about the trainee's journey, which position on the novice expert, compounds the disconnect and hampers acknowledgement of individual trainee development?
I think that probably sums it up in a really, really useful way. And I think it's why I've steered away in the wider project of talking about communities of practice as a theory that I've embraced, because I think the results don't suggest that linear movement at all, but that actually, some of the trainees, they really came across as insiders. Straight away, they were almost speaking like near peers about their supervisors. And I had one participant where when the supervisor put on their supervisor hat, the moments where they corrected him or where they had to steer him in a different direction, he found that really unsettling. He didn't know what to make of it because he was used to being positioned as a near peer. But what was really stark is when you contrasted the insider with the outsider. Obviously, it wasn't as crass as that, but actually those on the outside, it was almost as if they just didn't understand the rules of the game. And some of the participants, they were actually questioning, I know I'm doing something wrong, but I don't know what. They didn't understand. And I think the lovely thing about positioning is it's a trajectory you're allowed to move. And actually for some of them, they moved between the initial interview and the follow-up. You could see the position change. For others, it was actually a move of training practice that changed their vantage point. So actually being with a different supervisor who brokered their inclusion a little bit more, the perspective shifted and they started to understand what the rules were.
Thank you for that, Dawn. I had Sandra make a comment that she's used that framework with the dental student, which is interesting. And Matt says, I enjoyed the presentation. Are there any plans to get the trainer's voice? And would it be interesting to compare?
So this is part of a larger programme of work, actually. So it's a PhD. So the earlier studies published, which is the trainer's view. And I actually started with that first because I was a trainee when I started this work, and I felt really naive to the trainer's voice and very aware of my own bias in the whole thing. So I started talking to trainees initially, or trainers initially, what was really interesting was the variability between where they sat on all of this, that they really did have different views. And I spoke to really experienced trainers. They had about 60 years cumulative experience, but still had different expectations of what supervision should be. But I think this is probably a piece of work that will land most with trainers. And so actually I have presented it to a group of trainers in the Midlands to kind of see how it flew with them. And they did actually they did respond. I think it was useful for them to see where those areas of disconnect are and dissonance. I think it's probably fair to say that when it comes to supervisory alliances, it could be argued that it's the trainee's perspective of the quality of the alliance that often influences how much they engage, and that trainers can often overestimate the quality of the alliance. So it was really important for me to take time to hear the trainee voice in this, because in the systematic review that we did at the beginning, a lot of studies, they had a few trainee excerpts thrown in, but it was often supervisors that were spoken to.
Yeah. That fits in very nicely with the last question we've got time for, and it's one that I skipped earlier from Helen, who says, what are the practical applications of your work for GP trainers?
Yeah, I mean, I think really where I saw this landing, I hope, is that so many of the official documents that support the supervisory conversations that we have don't get to that next level of what each party's bringing to the table and what each person expects. So even things like developing a training needs assessment or thinking about learning goals can sometimes need a very experienced trainer to really understand all the different things that are pulling the trainee in a million different directions, and all the things that motivate them and all the things that they bring to the table already. And that's really difficult. And then also clarity. We can think we know what we're saying when we talk about, I want you to participate more. But perhaps the trainee doesn't really know what that means without being given some tools, or vice versa. And also the other practical thing I think for GPs is to recognise the influence of their practice. So with the best will in the world, those one-to-one interactions between a supervisor and a trainee, if it's not done in a context or a culture that's facilitating education, because it happens informally as well as formally, so much richness can be missed. And I don't know as trainers always either have the opportunity or the awareness of the importance of that aspect.
Lovely, thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for questions, Dawn, but there are more in the chat and you might get a chance to answer those. Meantime, I would just like everyone to say well done to you for a really interesting presentation. But we have to wait a few minutes while people unmute. And really at this point, I would like to just bring things to a close to say, I think if we can see all of our presenters, we've got all of the presenters here, at least on my screen. So I'd just like to invite all the panel and the audience as well to give everyone a really big enthusiastic round of applause. You'll need to unmute first. Well done. Yeah, I have to say the format hasn't disappointed. It's not quite the same as doing it all in person, but I think our three presenters have done a fantastic job today, and you could tell from the audience reaction, from the interesting questions, the depth of the questions, and the probing nature of the questions, that you've really stimulated all of us today. So I'd really like to thank the three of you very much indeed.